I had exactly 12 seconds to decide if the man who just called me furniture was worth saving from the 4 ghosts standing at his back. My fingers gripped the handle of the crystal carafe, the cold condensation bleeding into my palm like a premonition. To everyone in the Soul Noir bistro, the water I was pouring was just a refreshment. To me, it was the only thing standing between the silence of the room and the roar of a dozen suppressed handguns. Around me, the restaurant breathed with the heavy, rhythmic pulse of old money, the rhythmic clink of silver against bone china, the low, melodic hum of a cello in the corner, and the scent of expensive saffron and rain. Outside, New York's neon skyline screamed through the glass, a jagged crown for a city that never slept. But at table 4, the air was stagnant, heavy with the kind of arrogance that only comes with $1 billion and a body count to match. I leaned into the space between the titans like a shadow passing over a grave. Jang Wysong sat centered in his velvet booth, his presence so cold it seemed to freeze the steam rising from the plates. He was a masterpiece of lethal precision, bespoke charcoal wool, hair as dark and sharp as obsidian, and eyes that didn't just look at you, they dissected you. His hands were perfectly still, a predator who knew he was at the top of the food chain. Beside him, his second-in-command, Park Jin-young, adjusted a silk tie and laughed at a joke I'd just watched him rehearse in the kitchen mirror 10 minutes ago. Jin-young leaned in, his voice a honeyed rasp, asking Wysong if I was listening to their negotiation. Wysong didn't even blink. He didn't even turn his head. "She isn't listening because she isn't here," he said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that cut deeper than any blade. "People like her are invisible, Jin-young. They are part of the plumbing. You don't ask the pipes if they hear the conversation in the parlor." He thought I was part of the background. He was wrong. 20 seconds ago, I'd read the lips of the man in the charcoal suit 3 tables over, and he wasn't talking about the wine. He was counting down the seconds until he put a bullet through the back of Wysong's invisible head. The silence that followed Wysong's comment was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against my lungs. I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned further into his personal space, the scent of his cologne, something like expensive tobacco and cold rain, filling my senses. I watched the water overflow the rim of his glass, a single bead rolling down the side like a tear on crystal. "You're right, Mr. Jang," I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo through the sudden stillness of the bistro. "I am the plumbing. And like the pipes in your walls, I hear everything that flows through this room. Including the leaks." Wysong finally shifted. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like a glacier grinding against the earth. He turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto mine. There was no anger there yet, only a profound, icy curiosity. Behind him, the 4 men in suits became statues of tension, their hands hovering near the vents of their jackets. I straightened my spine, my hand steadying as I set the carafe down with a sharp clack on the white linen. "For instance," I continued, my gaze shifting to Park Jin-young, whose practiced smile was beginning to fray at the edges. "I heard your brother here tell the kitchen staff to lock the fire exits 3 minutes ago. He told them there was a gas leak. But the only thing leaking in this building is his loyalty." Jin-young's face went ash gray. "Sir, she's delusional. She's a waitress looking for a payout." "And the man at table 7? I interrupted, pointing a single, steady finger toward the back of the room. The man in question was a nondescript figure in a charcoal suit, but as my finger leveled at him, his hand vanished into his coat. "He's been staring at the nape of your neck for 20 minutes, Mr. Jang. He isn't waiting for the check. He's waiting for Jin-young to drop his napkin." That's the signal, isn't it? The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The cello player's bow shrieked against the strings and stopped. The low frequency of wealth was replaced by the high-pitched ringing of adrenaline. Wysong didn't look back at the assassin. He kept his eyes on me, searching my face for a tremor, a lie, a hint of fear. He found none. I had been invisible for 24 years. I had learned how to hide my soul long before I put on this uniform. "You called me furniture," I said, leaning down so my lips were inches from his ear, mirroring the intimacy Carolina had shown in the stories told of other bosses. "But furniture stays in the room when the people leave. It sees the deals made in the dark. It knows where the floorboards are loose. I felt the air change, a sudden, sharp shift in pressure. Jin Young, Wysong said, his voice deceptively soft. Drop the napkin. Jin Young froze. His hand, clutching a square of white silk, trembled. Sir, I. Drop it, Wysong commanded, a note of thunder vibrating in his chest. With a choked sob of terror, Jin Young let the silk fall. It fluttered to the floor like a dying bird. In that same heartbeat, the man at table 7 surged to his feet, the matte black barrel of a suppressed pistol clearing his jacket. But Wysong was faster. He didn't reach for a gun, he reached for me. His hand, large and calloused, clamped around my forearm and yanked me down behind the heavy oak table just as the first thwip of a bullet punched through the leather upholstery where his head had been a second before. The plumbing just saved your life, I hissed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird as glass shattered above us. Wysong looked at me in the cramped, dark space beneath the table, the neon lights of the city outside casting blue and red strobes across his sharp features. For the first time, he wasn't looking through me. He was looking at me. You aren't invisible anymore, Rhea, he murmured, the chaos of the room exploding into a symphony of gunfire and screams around us. And that might be the most dangerous thing you've ever been. The heavy oak table didn't just provide cover, it became a barricade between the world Rhea knew and the one she had just inherited. Above them, the symphony of fine dining had been replaced by the jagged, rhythmic percussion of gunfire. Crystal chandeliers, struck by stray rounds, rained diamonds of glass down upon the floor, the shards tinkling against the marble like frozen rain. Wysong's grip on Rhea's arm was like a band of heated iron. He wasn't panicked. His breathing was steady, a sharp contrast to the frantic drum of her own heart. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal wool coat, drawing a silver-plated handgun that looked more like a piece of jewelry than a weapon until he racked the slide with a mechanical, lethal click. Stay low, he commanded, his voice vibrating against her shoulder. When I move, you move. If you stop, you die. The betrayal was complete. From the shadows of the kitchen, 2 more men in waiters' jackets emerged, but they weren't carrying trays. They carried submachine guns. The plumbing Rhea had warned him about was bursting at the seams. Park Jin-young was nowhere to be seen, having vanished into the chaos he had choreographed, leaving his boss to die in the center of the room. Wysong surged upward, firing 3 precise shots over the edge of the table. The man at table 7 slumped over his expensive wagyu, the threat neutralized before he could even register the movement. But the restaurant was a kill box and the exits were still locked. The service elevator, Rhea gasped, her voice thick with the smell of cordite. It's behind the wine cellar. They won't expect us to go toward the vault. Wysong glanced at her, a predatory glint in his eyes. He grabbed her hand not as a captive, but as a lifeline, and they sprinted. The floor was a minefield of overturned chairs and spilled Bordeaux that looked indistinguishably like blood in the flickering light. As they reached the wine cellar, a Costa soldier stepped into their path. Wysong didn't waste a bullet. He slammed the man's head into the glass vault, the reinforced pane spiderwebbing but refusing to break. Before the soldier could recover, Wysong finished him with a single, brutal strike and shoved Rhea toward the narrow service corridor. The air here was colder, smelling of industrial cleaner and old grease. The transition from the gilded lotus to the gritty reality of the back hallways was jarring. They reached the elevator, the metal doors dented and scarred. Wysong slammed his palm against the button, his eyes darting back to the hallway they'd just left. The doors groaned open. Just as they stepped inside, a volley of bullets peppered the frame. Wysong pulled Rhea behind him, using his own body as a shield as the doors finally hissed shut. For a moment, there was only the mechanical hum of the lift and the sound of their ragged breathing. Rhea looked down at her hands. They were covered in a fine dust of pulverized crystal. You're bleeding, she whispered, noticing a crimson stain spreading across the shoulder of his bespoke suit. Wysong didn't even look at the wound. He looked at her. He reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of soot from her cheek. The gesture was unexpectedly tender, a strange grace note in the middle of a massacre. The glass shattered, he said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. There's no going back to being invisible, Rhea. You've seen the face of the devil, and now he knows your name. The elevator jolted to a stop at the basement level, the garage lights flickering through the grate. The war had moved outside, but as the doors opened, Rhea realized she wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a witness, a savior, and the only person Wysong could trust in a city that had just tried to swallow him whole. I don't want to go back, Rhea said, her voice finding a new, steel-edged clarity. Wysong smiled, a dark, fleeting thing. Good. Because the city is burning, and we're the only ones with the matches. As they stepped out into the freezing New York night, the sirens wailing in the distance, the girl who had been part of the plumbing was gone. In her place stood a woman who had tasted power and found that she liked the flavor even more than the wine. The blacked-out SUV tore through the slush of the Manhattan night, the city lights streaking across the reinforced glass like a blurred neon dream. Inside the cabin, the silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and the faint, wet sound of Wysong's blood soaking into his fine wool coat. Rhea sat pressed against the leather door, her waitress's apron crumpled and stained with soot, feeling the sudden, sharp weight of his gaze. He wasn't looking at her as a servant anymore. He was looking at her as a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. They arrived at a nondescript high-rise overlooking the Hudson. The safe house was a masterpiece of cold, brutalist design, all polished concrete, floor-to-ceiling mirrors and sharp angles. It was a palace of reflections, a place where it was impossible to hide from yourself. As the door clicked shut behind them, the adrenaline that had carried Rhea through the restaurant finally evaporated, leaving her knees weak and her mind racing. Wysong shed his coat with a hiss of pain, revealing a shoulder dress shirt turned dark with crimson. He slumped into a minimalist chair, the stark white light of the room highlighting the exhaustion etched into his features. The medicine cabinet, he rasped, gesturing toward a seamless panel in the wall. Second shelf. Get the kit. Rhea moved with the efficiency of a woman who had spent years navigating crowded dining rooms under pressure. She found the supplies and knelt beside him. Her hands, which had shaken when she poured his water, were now strangely steady. As she cut away the expensive silk of his sleeve, the mirrors surrounding them multiplied the scene a dozen times over, a dozen Rheas tending to a dozen dying kings. Why did you do it? Wysong asked, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. He didn't flinch as she pressed a sterile pad to the wound. You could have walked away. You could have let the plumbing do its job and gone home to your quiet life. Rhea didn't look up. My life was never quiet, Mr. Jang. It was just silent. There's a difference. She cleaned the grays with antiseptic, her eyes focused on the task. In my world, if you don't see the blow coming, you don't survive. I saw the blow. I just decided, for once, that I wasn't going to let it land. He reached out with his good hand, tilting her chin up until she was forced to look at him. In the reflections around them, she saw his men standing guard at the door, but in the glass directly in front of her, she saw only him. You have a gift, Rhea. You see the things people try to hide because they think you're beneath their notice. You're a ghost who knows the living's secrets. Is that why I'm here? She asked, her voice steady. To be your ghost? I'm in a war of shadows, he murmured, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw. My own family, the people I fed and protected, turned into vipers the moment I blinked. I don't need soldiers right now. I have plenty of those, and they're all bleeding or dead. I need someone who can walk through a room and come out with the truth without anyone ever realizing she was there. Rhea looked at her reflection in the mirror behind him. She looked different. The girl who had started the night as part of the plumbing was gone, replaced by someone whose eyes held the same cold fire as the man sitting before her. The safe house, with its endless mirrors, felt like a training ground. He was showing her all the different versions of herself she could become, the spy, the confidant, the survivor. You're not just a waitress anymore, Wysong said, his grip on her chin tightening slightly, though not enough to hurt. You're the only person in this city who hasn't tried to kill me today. That makes you the most valuable asset I own. I'm not an asset, she corrected him, pulling back just enough to break the contact but staying within his circle of heat. I'm the person who knows where your floorboards are loose. If I stay, it's not as a prisoner. It's as a partner. Waisong's lips curled into a genuine, albeit dangerous, smile. The pain in his shoulder seemed to vanish, replaced by a dark, predatory intrigue. A partner, he repeated, the word tasting like a challenge. Then prove it. The mirrors in this room aren't just for show, Rhea. Look at them. Tell me what you see that I've missed. Rhea stood up, turning to face the wall of glass. She didn't see the luxury or the fear. She saw the way the guards at the door shifted their weight when Waisong spoke. She saw the slight hesitation in the lead guard's eyes when he looked at the medicine cabinet. She saw the cracks in his empire that he was too close to notice. I see a man who thinks he's safe in a room full of glass, she said, her voice dropping into that smooth, velvet noir tone. And I see the person who's going to make sure no one throws a stone. The morning sun didn't rise over the Hudson so much as it bruised the sky, a cold palette of violet and gray that bled through the floor-to-ceiling mirrors of the safe house. Rhea stood by the glass, watching the city wake up, her reflection still wearing the ghost of last night's sip beneath her eyes. The transition from waitress to accomplice had happened in the span of a heartbeat, but the cost was only just beginning to settle into her bones. Waisong appeared behind her, his movements silent despite the heavy bandage beneath his fresh silk shirt. He didn't stand close enough to touch, but she could feel the gravity of his presence, a steady pull that made the rest of the world feel thin and inconsequential. You haven't slept, he noted, his voice a low rasp that stirred the quiet air. Invisible people don't get the luxury of closing their eyes, Rhea replied, turning to face him. If I blink, I might find myself back in that restaurant, or worse, back in the life where I didn't matter at all. But there's a price for what I did, isn't there? I didn't just save a life. I broke 100 laws of the world I used to live in. Waisong walked toward a sleek, black console, tapping a glass screen that projected a flickering series of dossiers into the air. The debt of sight is heavy, Rhea. You saw the rot inside my organization. In doing so, you've made yourself a target for every man who stood in that room. You can't go back to your apartment. You can't go back to the hospital to see your father. The mention of her father felt like a physical blow, a sharp intake of breath that she couldn't quite mask. He needs his medication. He needs the specialists. If I disappear, the payments stop. The plumbing doesn't just keep your building running, Mr. Zhang, it keeps my family alive. Waisong stepped into her space then, his eyes dark and unreadable. He reached out, his fingers grazing the edge of the glass console, shutting down the projections. Your father has already been moved. He is in a private wing of the best cardiac center in the state, under a name that doesn't exist on any public record. The debt you think you owe the world for your survival? I've bought it. But in my world, there is no such thing as a gift. There is only investment. Rhea felt the cage bars closing in, even if they were made of gold and silk. So that's the deal. My father's life for my eyes. My visibility for his safety. It's more than that, Waisong said, his voice dropping to a velvet whisper. You told me you wanted to be a partner. Partners don't just watch, they act. You've spent your life being overlooked, Rhea. Now, I'm going to use that. I'm going to turn your invisibility into a blade. He handed her a small, encrypted device, a sleek piece of hardware that felt cold in her palm. Jin Young has fled to the police chief's estate. He thinks he's safe because he's surrounded by badges and high walls. He thinks he's won because he knows my face and the faces of my soldiers. But he doesn't know yours. To him, you're still just the girl who poured the water. Rhea looked down at the device, then back at the man who had effectively erased her existence to save his own. The emotional arc of the morning was a jagged line, fear for her father, fury at her helplessness, and a dark, burgeoning thrill at the power Waisong was offering. She was no longer a bystander in a war. She was being forged into its most secret weapon. What do I have to do? She asked, her voice finding that steel-edged clarity once more. Waisong leaned in, his breath warm against her ear, a gesture that was both a promise and a threat. You're going to go back into the world, Rhea. You're going to walk right through their front gates, past their cameras and their guards. You're going to be the girl who cleans the floors, the girl who serves the tea, the girl who doesn't exist. And while they're busy ignoring you, You're going to tear their world down from the inside." He pulled back, his gaze searching hers. "The debt is paid, Rhea. Now, the work begins." As she looked into the mirrors surrounding them, Rhea didn't see a waitress anymore. She saw a shadow with a purpose. The debt of sight was a heavy burden, but as she gripped the device in her hand, she realized she was finally ready to carry it. She wasn't just part of the plumbing anymore, she was the poison in the pipes. The transition from the glass-walled tower to the service entrance of the police chief's estate felt like stepping through a tear in reality. Rhea stood in the pre-dawn mist, wearing a shapeless gray uniform and holding a heavy industrial floor polisher. Her hair was tucked beneath a plain cap, her skin stripped of even the faintest shimmer of the high-rise luxury she had just left. To the armed guards at the perimeter gate, she was a non-entity, a utility to be catalogued and dismissed. "Papers," one of the guards barked, not even looking at her face. He was busy checking his reflection in the side mirror of a black sedan. Rhea handed over the forged ID Waisong's team had manufactured. It felt like a thin sheet of ice in her hand. "Cleaning crew. Replacement for Maria," she said, pitch shifting her voice to a flat, weary monotone. The guard grunted, tapped the badge against a reader, and waved her through without a second glance. It was her first victory. The invisibility that had once been her greatest source of resentment was now her most lethal asset. As she pushed the heavy equipment across the marble foyer of the estate, Rhea's eyes weren't on the floor. They were on the reflections in the polished wood and the subtle shifts in the shadows. The chief's mansion was a fortress, but it was a fortress run by humans who loved their comfort. She watched the way the domestic staff moved, the rhythmic, unnoticed patterns of the people who made the world run. She blended into their frequency, a ghost moving through a house of secrets. She found Park Jin-young in the sunroom, sipping tea while the police chief looked over a stack of warrants. They were discussing the cleanup of the Gilded Lotus, as if they were talking about a plumbing spill, ironic, considering Waisong's earlier insult. "Waisong is dead or bleeding out in a ditch," Jin-young said, his voice dripping with a smug, oily satisfaction. "The girl is the only loose end. Find her, and we can close the book on the Kang family for good." Rhea continued to buff the floor just 10 feet away, the low hum of the machine masking the frantic thrumming of her heart. She didn't tense. She didn't look up. She simply moved the polisher in wide, hypnotic arcs. As she did, she subtly tilted the machine, using its chrome housing as a mirror to catch the reflection of the documents on the chief's desk. With a practiced, invisible motion, she reached into her pocket and activated the encrypted device Waisong had given her. It didn't beep or glow, it simply began to harvest the digital signatures of every phone and laptop in the room. "You're sure the waitress didn't see who pulled the trigger?" the chief asked, his brow furrowing as he lit a cigar. "She saw faces, but who's going to believe a server over a dozen sworn statements?" Jin-young laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "She's a shadow, Chief. And shadows disappear when you turn on the lights." Rhea felt a cold, sharp thrill run through her. They were so certain of her insignificance that they were handing her the very rope she would use to hang them. She finished the section of the floor and moved toward the hallway, her head bowed, her presence entirely erased by their arrogance. She spent the next hour moving through the house like a phantom. She planted bugs in the vents of the study and mirrored the contents of the chief's private server while dusting his bookshelf. By the time she reached the service exit at the end of her shift, she carried enough evidence to incinerate the city's political elite. As she stepped back into the morning air, the guard from the morning didn't even look up from his phone. "Have a good one, Maria," he muttered. "You too," Rhea replied, her voice soft and lethal. She walked 2 blocks before a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up beside her. The door slid open, and Waisong was there, his dark eyes searching hers for any sign of fracture. "Did you get it?" he asked. Rhea reached into her pocket and pulled out the device, handing it to him with a steady hand. "I got everything." They spent an hour talking about how I don't exist. Waisong took the device, but his fingers lingered on hers. The cold rain of the city began to fall, but for the first time in her life, Rhea didn't feel the chill. She felt the heat of a weapon being drawn. They were wrong, Waisong murmured, his gaze holding hers. You're the only thing in this city that's real. The SUV pulled away, leaving the estate behind. The girl who cleaned the floors was gone, and the architect of a new empire was starting to see the true shape of the war. The black SUV became a mobile command center as it glided through the rain-slicked labyrinth of Lower Manhattan. The interior was bathed in the ghostly blue luminescence of 3 different monitors, each scrolling through the raw data Rhea had harvested from the chief's estate. Waisong sat beside her, his face a mask of sharp shadows and cold intent, watching as the invisible waitress disassembled his enemy's lives with a series of keystrokes. They used an encrypted server disguised as a municipal payroll database, Rhea murmured, her fingers dancing across the screen with the fluid grace she'd once used to balance heavy serving trays. Jin Young wasn't just planning a coup, he was selling your supply chain to the Costa family in exchange for political protection. It's all here. The bribes, the shipping manifests, the recorded calls. Waisong leaned in, his shoulder brushing hers. The proximity was no longer a threat, it was a tether. Can you shut it down? I can do more than shut it down, Rhea said, a dark spark of triumph in her eyes. I'm the ghost in their machine now. They think they're looking for a waitress in a diner, but I'm already inside their bank accounts. I've rerouted the Costa payment to a dead drop account in the Cayman Islands. By the time they realize the money is gone, the chief will think Jin Young stole it, and Jin Young will think the chief is cutting him out. Waisong watched the screen as the digital icons of his rival's assets began to blink and vanish. You're sowing discord from within the walls they think are impenetrable. You're making them eat each other. It's what happens when you ignore the plumbing, Rhea replied, her voice dropping into that velvet noir register. The pressure builds until the pipes burst. And when they do, everyone gets dirty. As she worked, the emotional weight of her transformation began to settle. She was no longer just reacting to danger, she was orchestrating it. She saw the dossiers of the men who had laughed at her, the ones who had called her furniture and shadows. With every file she encrypted and every asset she froze, she was reclaiming the years she had spent being overlooked. She wasn't just a witness anymore, she was the judge. Suddenly, a red alert flashed across the center console. A high-priority communication was outgoing from the chief's private line. Rhea intercepted the signal, the audio bleeding through the car's speakers. It was Park Jin Young, his voice frantic and stripped of its earlier smugness. The funds haven't arrived, Chief. Someone is messing with the ghost accounts. I'm telling you, Waisong had a failsafe we didn't count on. It's not a failsafe, the chief's voice growled, distorted by the encryption. It's a leak. Find it, or I'll find someone to replace you. Rhea closed the connection, a cold smile touching her lips. He's panicked. He's going to move to his secondary location, the waterfront warehouse where they keep the off-book shipments. He'll go there to check the physical ledgers. That's exactly where I want him, Waisong said, his hand coming to rest on the back of Rhea's neck, a gesture of dark approval. He's running into the dark because he's afraid of a ghost he can't see. You've stripped him of his armor, Rhea. He looked at her then, truly seeing the woman she had become, a lethal blend of observation and execution. The waitress who had lived in the periphery was now the heart of his operation. The machine is ours, Rhea said, closing the laptop with a definitive snap. But Jin Young is still breathing. And he still thinks I'm just a shadow. Then let's show him how long a shadow can grow when the sun goes down, Waisong replied. The SUV swerved toward the docks, the engine a low, predatory growl. The digital war was won, but the physical reckoning was just beginning. Rhea looked at her reflection in the dark window, the city lights dancing in her eyes like a fire she had started and had no intention of putting out. She had become the ghost in the machine, and she was about to haunt them until there was nothing left but ash. The warehouse smelled of stagnant river water and rusted iron, a cold contrast to the sterile, mirrored luxury of the safe house. Rain drummed a frantic, uneven rhythm against the corrugated metal roof, sounding like 1,000 distant footsteps. Inside, the shadows were deep and jagged, sliced through by the swinging beams of flashlights held by Jin Young's remaining loyalists. Rhea moved through the stacks of shipping crates, her breath shallow and controlled. She had shed the cleaning uniform for tactical black, but the weight of the handgun at her hip felt alien, a heavy reminder that she had traded her invisibility for a target on her back. Waisong was somewhere in the rafters, a silent predator waiting for her signal. "Search every row." Jin Young's voice erupted from the center of the floor, his earlier composure replaced by a high-pitched, desperate edge. "The leak is coming from inside this building. If the funds don't move in 10 minutes, the chief is going to burn us both." Ria adjusted her headset, her fingers trembling slightly. This was the price. To be seen by Waisong meant being hunted by everyone else. She reached the corner of a crate marked with the Costa family crest and felt a sudden, sharp coldness at the base of her skull. "Found the shadow," a voice hissed. Before she could scream, a heavy hand clamped over her mouth and she was jerked backward. Her feet left the floor as she was dragged into the light of the central bay. The man holding her was one of the enforcers from the restaurant, his face still bruised from the shattered glass. He threw her to the concrete floor at Jin Young's feet. Jin Young looked down at her, his eyes wide with a manic realization. He didn't see a threat, he saw a miracle. "The waitress," he whispered, a twisted smile spreading across his face. "The little shadow from the Gilded Lotus. You're the one who's been playing ghost in my servers." Ria sat up, wiping a smear of grease and blood from her lip. She looked into the mirrors of the rainy windows high above, seeing the silhouettes of men closing in. "I'm the one who saw you rehearsal your lies in the kitchen mirror, Jin Young. I'm the one who knows you're broke." Jin Young's smile vanished. He reached down, grabbing her by the hair and forcing her head back. "You think you're a player now? You think because Waisong gave you a seat at the table, you're one of us? You're just a witness we forgot to kill." He pulled a knife from his belt, the blade catching the flickering overhead light. "I'm going to send your eyes back to Waisong in a box. Let's see how much he values his partner then." The stakes had never been higher. Ria could feel the cold steel near her skin, but she didn't beg. She looked past Jin Young, toward the dark heights of the ceiling. She had been hypervigilant her entire life, watching for the subtle signs of danger. Now she watched for the sign of her salvation. "You're right about one thing," Ria said, her voice dropping into a lethal, calm baritone. "I am a witness. And I've seen exactly where you're standing." A single red dot appeared on Jin Young's chest, centered perfectly over his heart. "The signal," she whispered. The warehouse roof exploded into a rain of glass and black-clad figures. The first shot didn't come from a gun, but from Ria herself. She drove her elbow into Jin Young's knee and rolled away as a suppressed round thudded into the concrete where she had been seconds before. Waisong dropped from the rafters like a fallen god, his movements a blur of violet shadows and silver flashes. He didn't go for the soldiers. He went straight for Ria, shielding her with his body as the bay erupted into a symphony of gunfire. He pulled her up, his hand gripping hers with a desperate intensity. "Are you hit?" "No," Ria gasped, her lungs burning. "But they know who I am now. There's no hiding anymore." Waisong looked at her, his dark eyes burning with a mixture of fury and something that looked dangerously like pride. "Then let them look. We're done hiding in the shadows, Ria. If the world wants to see you, we'll give them a vision they'll never forget." As they fought their way toward the exit, the warehouse burning behind them, Ria realized that the price of being seen wasn't just the danger, it was the loss of the woman who was afraid to be noticed. She was no longer a shadow. She was the light that was going to burn the city down. The skyline of Manhattan glittered like a spilled chest of jewels, but from the penthouse ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, the city looked less like a home and more like a map of territories to be reclaimed. The Grand Masquerade was the social event of the season, a sea of silk, lace, and ivory masks designed to hide the predatory nature of the city's elite. Ria moved through the crowd, not as a ghost, but as a vision. She wore a gown of midnight velvet that clung to her like a second skin, her face partially obscured by a mask of laser-cut obsidian. The invisible waitress was dead. In her place was a woman who commanded the air around her. Beside her, Waisong walked with the measured grace of a king returning to a rebellious court. His tuxedo was a sharp, dark armor, and though his face was hidden by a matching mask, his eyes burned with a cold, terrifying recognition. "Keep your breathing steady," Wysong murmured, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "To them, you are an enigma. A foreign investor, a New York mystery. Let their own arrogance blind them." "I've spent a lifetime watching them from the edges," Wysong, Rhea whispered back, her voice a low, confident velvet. "They only see what they expect to see. And tonight, they expect a celebration. They don't expect the plumbing to finally burst." Across the ballroom, near a fountain of flowing champagne, Park Jin-young stood beside the police chief. They were unmasked, their faces flushed with the premature wine of victory. They were surrounded by the very men Rhea had digitally bankrupted 48 hours ago, yet they still believed they held the keys to the city. The music shifted, a string quartet beginning a haunting, minor key waltz. It was the signal. "Dance with me," Wysong commanded, leading her into the center of the floor. As they spun, Rhea used the movement to survey the room. She wasn't looking at the fashion or the jewelry. She was counting the exits, identifying the plainclothes enforcers, and spotting the subtle bulges of holsters beneath tailored coats. Every rotation brought them closer to the center of the betrayal. "Now," Wysong breathed. Rhea reached into the hidden slit of her gown and pulled out a small, sleek transmitter. With a flick of her thumb, she activated the ghost protocol they had built in the SUV. Simultaneously, every digital screen in the ballroom, the silent auction monitors, the decorative projections, even the guests' smartphones flickered and died. A second later, they surged back to life, displaying the ledger Rhea had stolen from the warehouse. The bribes, the Costa manifests, and the recorded audio of Jin-young plotting the chief's own eventual replacement scrolled in high definition for every guest to see. The music faltered and died. The hum of wealth turned into a jagged gasp of collective shock. Rhea and Wysong stopped dancing exactly 3 feet from Jin-young. Rhea reached up and slowly peeled away her obsidian mask. The silence that followed was absolute. Jin-young's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble. He looked at Rhea, his eyes bulging as he recognized the woman from the Gilded Lotus, the furniture that had just dismantled his life. "You," he hissed, his voice cracking. "You called me invisible," Rhea said, her voice projecting to the farthest corners of the silent hall. "You said shadows disappear when you turn on the lights. But you forgot one thing, Jin-young. When the lights are this bright, the shadows are the only things that stay sharp." Wysong stepped forward, removing his own mask. The power in the room shifted so violently it was almost physical. The ghost had returned to claim his throne. "The masquerade is over," Wysong announced, his voice a low thunder. The chief reached for his sidearm, but Rhea was faster. She didn't use a gun. She simply held up her phone, showing the live stream of the data being uploaded to the federal prosecutor's server in real time. "If a single shot is fired," Rhea said, her gaze leveled at the chief, "the keys to your private vault go public. You aren't just losing your career tonight. You're losing your legacy." The room erupted into a different kind of chaos, not a shootout, but a scramble for survival as the city's elite realized the invisible woman had trapped them all in a web of their own making. Amidst the panic, Wysong took Rhea's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "The queen has arrived," he murmured, looking at her with an intensity that rivaled the burning city lights outside. Rhea looked at her reflection in the towering ballroom mirrors. She didn't see a waitress or a ghost. She saw the architect of the new world. The masquerade was finished, and for the first time in her life, everyone was looking at her. The sirens of the NYPD were a distant, melodic hum against the backdrop of the Hudson River, but inside the black-on-black SUV, the world was silent. The city was still vibrating from the aftershocks of the Pierre Hotel, the digital execution of a police chief, and the public stripping of a mafia traitor, but Rhea felt a strange, hollowed-out calm. She sat in the back seat, her midnight velvet gown draped around her like the discarded skin of a past life. Beside her, Wysong leaned back against the leather, his hand still firmly interlaced with hers. "The car didn't stop at the safe house." It bypassed the high-rises and the neon glare of Midtown, heading toward the private airfield where a jet sat fueled and waiting. The transition is complete, Wysong said, his voice breaking the stillness like a low frequency of power. He wasn't looking at the city anymore. He was looking at her. The chief is in custody. Jin Young is a man without a country, hunted by his own associates. The plumbing has been replaced, Rhea. Every pipe in the city now leads back to us. Rhea looked down at their joined hands. The ballpoint ink from her shift at the bistro was gone, replaced by the weight of a heavy, emerald-cut diamond ring Wysong had slipped onto her finger as they exited the ballroom. It wasn't just a gift, it was a seal of office. "And my father?" she asked, her voice steady. "He's already on the plane," Wysong replied. "The cardiac wing and soul is waiting. He'll have the best care in the world, under the protection of my personal guard. He'll never know the name of the woman who saved him. He'll only know that his daughter became something more than a shadow." Rhea felt a final, lingering knot of anxiety unravel in her chest. The debt was settled. The invisible girl had bought her father's life with the secrets of the powerful. They reached the tarmac, the jet's engines whining in the cold night air. As the door opened, the winter wind whipped Rhea's hair across her face, but she didn't shiver. She stood on the edge of the stairs, looking back at the New York skyline, the city that had tried to swallow her whole, the city where she had spent years pouring water for men who didn't know her name. "You have a choice, Rhea," Wysong said, standing behind her, his presence a shield against the wind. "The plane can take you anywhere. I've set up accounts that will ensure you never have to see a menu or a floor polisher again. You can be truly invisible now, quiet, safe, and forgotten. Or you can walk onto that plane with me." Rhea turned to look at him. The man who had called her furniture was gone. In his place was a man who saw her as his equal, his eyes reflecting the same dark ambition that now burned in her own soul. "I'm done with being quiet," Rhea said, her voice cutting through the roar of the engines. "And I don't want to be safe. I spent my whole life being safe, and all it got me was a front-row seat to other people's lives." She stepped toward him, closing the distance until their shadows merged on the cold asphalt. "You said the city is burning. I want to be the one who decides what rises from the ash." Wysong smiled, a genuine, lethal expression that reached his eyes. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the cabin, the entrance to his world, his empire, and his future. "Then welcome home, Rhea," he murmured. "The throne is waiting." As the jet climbed into the black velvet sky, Rhea looked out the window at the flickering lights below. The girl who was part of the plumbing was officially dead. The shadow had stepped out of the corner and taken her seat at the head of the table. She wasn't just a witness to history anymore. She was the one who would write it. The new empire wasn't built on blood and silk alone, it was built on the sight of a woman who had finally decided to be seen.